Hi, everyone. I just want to thank you for joining us this evening. I'm Emily, and I'm one of the events hosts here at Powell's. And before we begin, I just have a couple quick announcements. I want to encourage you to check out our lineup of upcoming virtual events by visiting our website at powells.com. If you don't do so already, please also consider following us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. Tonight, we are so very excited to welcome Claire Messud and Hilton Als. Claire is the author of 6 works of fiction, including the New York Times bestsellers The Emperor's Children and The Burning Girl. A recipient of the Guggenheim and Radcliffe Fellowships and the Strauss Living Award from the American Academy of Arts and Letters, she lives in Cambridge, Massachusetts with her family. Her new book, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, opens a window on her own life, her upbringing, a warm, complicated family, and throughout it all, her devotion to art and literature. It offers a vivid portrait of a life and celebration of the power of literature. Joining Claire in conversation this evening is Hilton Als. Als' most recent book, White Girls, was a finalist for the National Book Critics Circle Award and the winner of the Lambada Literary Award in 2014. He won the Pulitzer Prize for Criticism in 2017. He's an associate professor of writing at Columbia's University School of the Arts and has taught at Yale, Wesleyan, and Smith. So this evening's event also includes Q&A. There's a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. Please type a question in there if you would like it to be asked. As well, if someone has typed a question that you would also like to know the answer to, please consider upvoting it. The more votes it gets, the more likely it is to be asked. And perhaps most importantly, please consider supporting Claire and Powell's by purchasing a copy of her new book. I'll be sharing a link to buy the book multiple times throughout the event this evening. Claire, Hilton, it's such a pleasure to welcome you. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you for having us. And I'm so happy to see Claire again. And I'm going to hold up my advanced copy of Claire's book, which is just an extraordinary, it's subtitled An Autobiography in Essays. And after 6 novels and many pieces that are not even collected in the book, I'm very interested to ask Claire about the frame of this book, which she begins by talking about how we don't know ourselves if we don't know our past. And it's a very long, beautiful introduction to the book that was fascinating in terms of language being something that was unifying and separating when it came to her family. I feel as if I want to tell you all about the book, but I want Claire to share some of this story with us, which is really about displacement and about the ways in which we get to steady ourselves by having a narrative that we can share, whether it be reading or looking at art or questioning the use and abuse of literature in some senses and ways. Anyway, I love the book and I wanted to do this event with Claire because it's such a rich, tender-hearted read and also a very complicated one about family throughout. Many of the pieces are concerned with family and the ways in which women in particular become artists and have families. So those are a lot of the subtext, Claire, that I took away from the book, which I loved reading and dipping into again. And I wanted to ask you about the genesis of the project.
Well, thank you, Hilton. Thank you for your lovely words, and I can't tell you how much they mean to me and how wonderful it is to be here with you. So thank you so
Good to
much.
see you. Yes.
Yeah. So there are actually essays or pieces in this book that from the past 20 years. I think that the oldest the oldest ones are from the turn of the century, basically, which it sounds a little odd, but there is some question, why now and why these pieces? And I think because it's by no means all the critical pieces that I've written. So there's some, the first part is personal pieces, and then the second part, the second half of the book is critical pieces, largely about books, but a couple about artists. And I was choosing books that or artists and writers whose work means a lot to me. I think in that sense, I sort of see the book as a whole as almost the autobiography of my way of seeing the world, if that makes sense. It not so much about what I've done in any particular day or where I've been, but more about this way of seeing the world. And I think the reason for why now is linked to that, and is linked to this the fact that my I refer to it in the book. My grandfather, my French grandfather, my father was French. My French grandfather, in his retirement, spent several years writing a memoir for my sister and for me, not for publication, just for us. And he called it Everything That We Believed In. And a couple of years ago, I had a leave from teaching, and I read the whole thing. It's quite long. It's 1,500 pages handwritten with photographs and letters and telegrams pasted in. And I read the whole thing from beginning to end, which I never had before. And really, he wanted to share with us what his life was like, what my grandparents' life was like. It covers the period 1928 to 1945. So it's a very particular, they were married in 28, and of course 45 was the end of the war. So that's what he wanted to share with us. But it was also about a culture that I'm sure, that they never thought would end. When they were young, they thought it would always be there. And they were, so during the war, when he thought that he and potentially my grandmother might die, he wrote a letter that was for my father and my aunt that he included in the memoir, and it was to explain to them, we are these things in this order. We are Mediterranean, we are Latin, we are Catholic, we are French.
Yes.
So that was the order of the world for him, and as if he was doing sort of scientific, genus, species, this is what we are. And I think it was reading that I realized how mystifying it must be that have been to him, that his grandchildren were North American Anglophone, essentially secular, but if anything, Protestant kids, right? They were so far from anything he could have imagined. And I think I have had a similar, somewhat vertiginous experience in the past few years. I mean, it happened with the election in 2016 of thinking that I had a sort of teleological worldview. I thought we were all part of a project moving towards a world of light and truth and science and fact and inclusivity and cosmopolitanism and lowering boundaries and welcoming strangers and all sorts. That I thought there were certain things that were agreed upon goods and good things, and that we were imperfect at them, but we were working towards them. And I think it was like being at the fun fair and that spinny thing and the floor drops. I think suddenly I had this feeling, is everything that we believed in gone?
Well, it's very interesting because throughout the book, one of the things that I love throughout the book is that there are always questions of faith. For instance, in the piece called, I think it's Two Women, sorry. You talk initially about your father dying, and then you talk about marriage and about the ways in which we join and make family, and is part of the glue of that faith. And then throughout, if one reads the book carefully, you see that it's plotted throughout a lot of the pieces. This question of belief and how do we establish first of all, how do we establish a connection with someone, and then how do we maintain it, whether it's as reader to writer, artist to the page, artist to the canvas. This idea of faith and belief is something that's very powerful in the text. And do you think that was something that was passed down to you as an idea, or was it something that you subconsciously held on to, having lived in so many different places? I think you should tell the reader the many countries that you've lived in. I mean,
Well,
the listener, the listener.
we moved around a lot when I was growing up, and it's also true that my father, because he was French, but he wasn't just French, he was pied-noir, so his
Yes,
family was French from North Africa. So they were colonials,
yes,
and so it was even more complicated, because once Algeria became independent, then the place that they had thought of as home was quite rightly no longer part of France. So, but it meant that was what was home for him. So I think that feeling of displacement, of kind of not belonging places, we inherited it. My
yes.
mother, who was Canadian, was incredibly, she was incredibly placed. Toronto, her home was very specific. It was Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and more than that, it was the west end of Toronto, where she grew up. Near High Park. It was, she was somebody who was always trying to get back to her rooted place.
Yes,
um,
yes.
and he was sort of the opposite. But
I think it was
that
also something that you that's very moving about that, is that the marriage was about her trying to give him something that he didn't have on some level. I felt that when I was reading it, certainly.
And I think him not being able to accept that, in a
Right,
way, right?
exactly.
He couldn't. They were people who loved each other, but were not perhaps best suited.
Suited for each
but
other. Yeah.
but in the matter of faith, I think that the intensity of faith that, say, my grandfather and grandmother, my French grandparents, felt for the Catholic Church, I feel like I was somehow, in some weird sort of, almost the way the duckling will imprint on whatever it sees first. I don't know
Mm.
if it was that, but I feel literature is that for me. and
Yes,
and I have often said, I I feel I am a writer the way a nun or monk feels they have a calling. Like,
yes.
and I think in some way, this, if there's a common thread in the book, it's my faith in language, and my
Yeah,
faith in communication,
yeah.
and in the effort of communication, even though it always fails, right? It's
Well,
never.
I mean, what you were saying earlier about believing that we were at least in the same cosmos, and that there was a chance for science and fact and language to prevail. Um, I don't think that this is something that is just um, a reaction to politics at the moment. I think it's something that you've always felt. You've always believed in two things, it seems to me: the rational and the imaginative world simultaneously. That when you put the book down, that there would be reason, and when you pick the book up, there would be the reason of the imagination. Do you feel that your fiction was a way of extending your reading, the pleasure of reading and love of reading,
um
making up stories?
Making up stories, I think, it almost becomes, and maybe, I don't know if you would agree with this, but I think you might, just knowing how you have sort of turned, you said in an interview about how with time you've turned to writing from the inside,
Yes,
and that in that sense, it leads you to fiction, right?
yes.
Instead of looking at things to inhabit things, that leads one to fiction. And I think in that sense, that's very much what I feel about the gift of fiction as a reader and as a writer, is that it enlarges your understanding of the world, and it enlarges your experience. And in fact, it is a sort of experience. Reading is an experience. And for me, I really feel that it sounds silly, but I'm interested in what it's like to be alive on the planet,
Mhm.
whoever that is, whoever that may be, wherever that person may be, what century they're in. I'm interested in what it is to be human. And and I think that when I'm writing, I'm trying to explore that. And I know that when I'm reading, when I'm happiest reading, it's because I'm experiencing some version of that.
Claire, can you talk to us a little bit about? I love the book so much, and I don't want to give. I want people to buy it, so I keep little minefields in my mind of. But I wanted to ask you about how you began writing, and what was, because you wrote lots of fiction before you published this nonfiction book, and what was there a pull, much more powerful pull to fiction than nonfiction for many years? Or I know you were doing both simultaneously, but
Well, but it's certainly true that I've always thought of myself as a fiction writer first and foremost,
mm,
and I think that comes. I look. All stories are made up. So
yeah,
it's maybe a made up story that I have about myself, but I certainly do have the memory. I have the memory of first being able to read.
hmm,
And it was a book that my mother had read to me. I was sitting on my bed. It was about Farmer McDonald's apples. And suddenly, I was turning the pages and pretending to read. And I suddenly realized I could read the words. And it was so incredibly exciting.
yeah,
um, it was like getting a driver's license is for my son is 16 and just got his driver's license. And it's like the world has opened up. But that's what the moment. I mean, I had this very distinct memory of the book and the room and me in it, and it was a eureka moment. And I think by the same token, I think when I understood that the stories that my mother read to us, or that I started to read, when I understood that they weren't like stones and rivers and trees, things that had always been there, but
hmm,
they were things that people had made up,
hmm,
I said, I want to do that. That's
yes,
what I want to do.
because it's a form of autonomy, right? And it's a form of power. You're able to reason the world through your own lens. You're able to understand not only what society is, what family is, but what the self is in relation to all of that stuff. And so when I was reading one of the essays I love so much called Teenage Girls in this piece, again, it's about self-awareness through language and bodies. And can you talk to us a little bit about that piece? I'm just trying to give them a sense of the arc of the book. Yeah.
Oh, thank you. Yeah. So that piece. So my last novel is a book called The Burning Girl, and it's about the friendship between two girls as they grow apart in that transition of adolescence from childhood towards adulthood. So that's what the novel is about. And I wrote the piece in a way to articulate some of why I wrote that why I wrote that novel, or why it was so important to me to write that novel. And so the piece itself is in part about my experience as a mother,
Mhm.
and having a daughter who sort of went through that. And there's a lovely thing that Laurie Moore says in a book review that's in her collected essays, and I can't remember what the book is that she's reviewing, but she says adolescence is like a howling dog. Eventually it is buried, but it is buried alive. And
Wow.
and I
Yes.
think the experience for me of watching my daughter, living with my daughter, going through her adolescence, from a different perspective as a parent, you can't. It's a different perspective, but it dug up my howling dog.
Yeah. Yes.
It dug up my own howling dog. So then there were two howling dogs in the house. And so in a way, it brought up for me this not just experiences from the teenage years, but in particular this memory about a friend who died. So we lived in Australia when I was small, and then we moved to Canada, and I kept in touch with some of my good friends from Sydney. I was in a small class. I was at a girls' school in a small class of girls, and we all knew each other well. And but you know, I was pen pals with sort of three of them, I guess. And they wrote to tell me when we were teenagers that another of our friends had died.
Yes.
And I think for me, it was the first person my age I'd ever known who died. And it also was very bound up with this thing of stories and storytelling, because it was like the Gospels. From each girl, I got some little snippet, like a shard, and I was trying to put it together, and the shards didn't quite align, you know, and so I ended up almost having a story in my head that was an invented story, because you know,
Because there was room for invention. It wasn't, you know, between the cracks, there were these little spaces where you could fill in, and as
and where
you're
you
filling
want,
in,
yeah,
yeah,
you wanted to fill in, because if without it, it didn't fully make sense.
right,
But it's possible also that in the filling in, um, it became something completely fictional, right?
yeah,
And for me, it raised this question of, which I think I've been aware of ever since then, which is, what do we really know? How
mhm,
much do we really know? And how much are we actually making things up? And what is the truth? Is there, I mean, there are facts, but the truth of what happens is always more complicated, because to make sense of the facts, we make a story, and when we make a story, we have choices about what to include and what to exclude, and what order to put the facts, you know.
mhm,
um and so, and that's what fiction is. It's some way of making sense of the world by 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 ordering events and interactions and communications in a certain way that hopefully allows both for understanding and for the mystery, right? I
yes,
think that's one of the things that I think of as being actively different in fiction from nonfiction, is that it's part of fiction's responsibility to allow for the mystery.
yes. There's that wonderful interview, a very long interview in the 70s, I think it was, a Truman Capote and Rolling Stone interview, and he was supposed to write I think it would have been a great piece about Rolling Stones on tour, and he couldn't do it. And he was being interviewed by the publisher, and he said, what were the problems? And he said, well, essentially there was no mystery. There
Mm.
was nothing that I couldn't figure out about the performances or the tour, or the people who were around. And I think that one of the great things about your writing is that it has the element of surprise always. And does your writing surprise you? Are you Claire, surprised by Claire, the writer?
I'm certainly, when I'm writing fiction, I mean, also when I'm writing, you know, way back in college, didn't you have, like, when you're writing an essay, you're like, oh, look, who knew I thought that about that, you know, who knew I thought that about World War II? But here it is,
Yes,
3 a.m. and I've just
yes,
discovered that I had this thought about World War II.
yes,
Um, yeah, I mean, I always think that writing is a means of discovery. And you know, if you actually had a very clear sense of everything you wanted to write, you just do the outline and leave it at that,
yes,
right? But especially with fiction, but even with nonfiction, I think there are always, um, in the same way that when you have a conversation, you might think you know your opinion, but when you enter into a conversation with somebody, at the end of the conversation, you've changed.
yes. It's sort of, I mean, one of the wonderful aspects of this book is the structure, and the reason that I bring up the piece about your daughter, and because it's two generations, right? You're in the first half of the book, it's you, and it's about becoming, and then all of a sudden there's a new generation that you've created that's becoming, and then there's, you know, the piece ends, and then we go to Camus, And I think it's just a wonderful structure. Structurally, it's very brilliant because you couldn't continue with that section because your daughter's life is continuing. You couldn't take it any further because your life as a mother and nurturer, and then a new generation of you is in the world. So then I love that, and then I turn the page and we go to Camus, who of course, like your father, was an outsider in a colonial culture, and you write so passionately about Camus, and in a way that made me go back to his work, and also to understand what I had loved about it, reading The Plague and so on, books that were very important to me when I was growing up. So can we talk about, I want to talk about ventriloquism in a funny way, because Camus gets to speak for your father, right? And he's speaking to you, and he's speaking, how do I put this? A lot of kids, students of mine, believe that they've invented colonialism as a subject. And God bless them, and I love them. But one of the things that I intend on doing is giving them your essays to let them know that this has been a very old problem, and it's not about whiteness, and it's not about blackness, but it's about power and about being disenfranchised from your own country. So can we talk a little bit about Camus and how, in a way, he might have been speaking for your father and speaking to you as your father would have?
Yeah, and I just I was I just want to say I was smiling earlier when you said about my daughter, and it was like, then you come to the end. I remember when I was pregnant with Livia, a
It's a
British,
beautiful name, by the way.
thank you, a British friend in that sort of dour and ironic way said, "Well, you do understand that metaphysically, it's the end for you."
Wow, really?
Yeah. and and and
Wow.
it, and it's sort of true. It's like it's a delayed effect, but now
Yes,
that she's a young adult becoming, right, and it's true,
yes.
like metaphysically it's kind of the end for this generation, but I'm not giving in yet. I'm not giving up. But
Yeah,
it would just made me smile because it's I mean it is actually true, right?
yes.
But in terms of Camus, I think, one of the things that I find incredibly moving about him is that he was somebody, as you say, colonialism is about power. It is also about race. I mean, but power ultimately. And he's somebody who came from the humblest.
I should be more specific. Race is the signifier for
Right.
something larger that affects people, despite, in spite of race. It affects us. That's what I meant. I should have
Right.
just been more
Right.
specific. Sorry. Mhm.
Right. No, but just so he came from a very humble background. His father, who was a soldier, died in the first weeks of the First World War. His mother was deaf. He grew up with his mother and his grandmother, and his older brother, who left school by the age of 11 to be an apprentice. His teachers had to come and beg the grandmother, because the grandmother actually ruled the roost. Beg the grandmother to let him stay in school and say that because he was a good student. So he came from this very humble background, and talking about being disenfranchised in some way. I mean, he was somebody who, I mean, you can look at how he was treated in Paris much later by Sartre and his friends. I mean, they were all friends until they all started to get snobby about him not having the right education, not having the right background, not being, not being sophisticated in the ways that the society, that the elite of Paris felt he should be. But what I was going to say is, I think the thing that I found, and that just in terms of my own family background, I think there were in Algeria, there there were wealthy colonialists who owned vast estates and ruled the colony, and there were a lot of people who came. I mean, it was settled in the way South Africa was settled, in the way the United States was settled, for that matter, as a place for peasants to move to and have a better life in the 19th century. So there were a lot of poor, uneducated, disenfranchised people. My grandmother's father was illiterate. So my grandmother, who became an elementary school teacher, her generation was the first in her family to be able to read. Just to sort of and there's a whole broader conversation that we'll save for another day about how those people end up politically. I mean, you can look in South Africa, and the Boer people are the sort of cultural equivalent of the pied-noir peasants, right? And they tend to be very conservative, and they tend to be racist, and they tend to be a number of other things. Yes. But in terms of Camus, he was somebody who came from that background and did not espouse those beliefs, and he had a dream of an Algeria that would afford equal opportunities for everybody, but that would remain French. And I think that's part of what I find so moving about him, is that he could go so far and no further. And I think from the distance of whatever it is, 70 years, 60 years, we might now say, well, look, it was a failure in him. But he also makes the case he makes for his love of Algeria is an animal case. It's a case for a visceral love of the land and the ocean and the sky and the plants and so on. And so he's holding in his hands at the same time an idea of justice that he knows what he knows justice to be. And he was somebody who fought for justice in a lot of contexts and really struggled for justice. And this sort of atavistic body love of a land that he didn't want to give up.
Yes.
And I find that paradox very human and tragic and moving.
Well, it's funny because the pieces in the second half of the book about books and criticism, there are a number of people who are displaced and who don't, who make a language out of, I want to say who make a language out of the many languages that they've had to impersonate in order to survive. And one of those artists is Jane Bowles, of course, who was a middle-class American Jewish girl who ends up living in Mexico, North Africa, etc., with her husband, Paul Bowles, and both are queer, but they're married. And can you tell us, I know that she has a very intense following, and it took me a long time to understand her. I think I was way too young when I started, but can you tell us a little bit about that and maybe some of the parallels? She was not directly political like Camus, but on the other hand, there are many political things in her writing about women and about independence.
Right, and I think the very nature of her independence, as a thinker and a writer, is part of what was deeply radical about her. There's nobody really like her. You can't really compare her. I mean, I don't know. Is there someone to whom you'd compare her as a?
Not never. I could never. I think something like Juna Barnes is the Book of Repulsive Women. A little bit, but Juna's language was Germanic, and Jane's language was, it felt always to me that it was a colloquialism struggling to get through Europeanism.
Right, right.
That she had been trained in French and so on, and so that the colloquial ear is always trying to get through classical French literature anyway.
Yes, and I do, I think in the piece I write about her because it's how I experience her novel. It's her one novel, Two Serious Ladies. Hilton is a great Jane Bowles scholar, and I mean, it does feel like a passionate. I feel as though, I feel as though we have like a secret handshake. Anybody,
Yes.
who shares a love of Jane Bowles, it feels very intimate somehow. And I think there is something very intimate about, because because she seems. So what I was going to say is the piece is about is about my case for her as an existentialist, as an American woman existentialist writer, and that she's very funny, and there's a lot of humor, and people call her quirky, but actually the stakes in the novel for these two women, the two serious ladies of the title, are incredibly high. They're of the highest. It's about how then must we live, right? How do you live authentically in this world? And I think that, as you say, it's sort of, it's a sensibility of somebody who always, she do you remember, then she called herself, because of her limp and
Yeah.
so on, and being Jewish and queer, she called herself Krippy the Kike Dyke.
Yes.
Yeah, she that was but I think she was somebody who was always at an angle to the society into which she was born. She was always liminal at the edge. And then I think that time she spent in Europe, and her European education, um, as you say, gave her a language, but also, I think, a worldview that she then brought to bear on an American spirit, in
It's
some way.
it's very interesting, because when I went back to reread the Camus, I saw lots of parallels between the two of them that I hadn't noticed ever before. So I think that that's something that's very powerful in the book. And then I hate jumping around like this, but I want people to get a sense of the scope of the book. And you also um, go to two serious ladies whom I love as well, Alice Neal and Marlene Dumas, two visual artists, mothers, who were able to somehow find a way to make their world in not great circumstances, largely single mothers, right? And I remember Marlene saying to me once that she'd always wanted to have a child. And I asked her why. And she said, because when she first got to Holland and women said, well, I would never give up my work. And she said, I would never sacrifice my work for a child, but their work was so awful. She said that, it's like, how could you not have the child? And so it's very, similarly with Alice saying, my children want to be respectable. Richard's a lawyer and Hartley's a doctor, and so I wanted to maybe, I know that they wanted to ask a lot of questions, so I wanted to round off with those again, with this feeling of identification and looking, but also being removed, but also seeing some of Claire in there.
Well, and I think, for anybody who's a woman interested in making art, that child question is huge. I was certainly brought up to believe, if you want to be an artist, don't have kids.
Yeah.
And what I thought I would.
Was that a struggle for you at first, or that question?
Well, I was sure I would not have kids. When I was young, I was sure that was a necessary sacrifice. And then, I met James, and who's my husband. And initially I remember him saying he wanted 6 kids. I was like,
No.
no,
That's
go find
way too
somebody else.
English. Yeah.
Somebody else for that. That's not,
Yeah.
but that there actually came a time when we had a version of Marlene Dumas conversation. I remember us having this conversation, like, the sacrifice for art. Okay, so let's look at people we know who made a choice not to have children, and if you could be that artist, if you could, people who wrote amazing work, like, would it be worth it to be that person? And we kept coming up with the answer, more life is more life.
Yes.
And I
It's
certainly,
what
and
it's what Baldwin said when his secretary said, "I don't understand how you can be with people all night and then go to your room to write." And he said, "If I didn't do that, I wouldn't be living life."
yeah.
And why
And
should you choose? Why should you choose, right?
why should you choose, and surely more life. And I really believe this, even when I look at Alice Neal, even though I know how much she suffered,
Yes.
and how much the essentially the loss of her two daughters, right? I mean, she
Yes.
lost her two daughters, and it was
Yes.
a terrible suffering. But I feel like her life and her work were so enhanced, were so much greater for being a mother,
Yes.
right? And I don't, I just, I feel like, is there, is it's not that it's not that I'm saying, it's not that I'm advocating that everybody should go out and have children, but I think that there was, for a long time, for women, a narrative that said that art and life were incompatible. I mean, that art and motherhood were incompatible. And I really don't believe that's true. And I actually believe it enables other things.
I think it provides a kind of frame too, right? I mean, if you in reading your wonderful pieces and listening to you a little bit, uh, it you have a certain amount of hours a day before they come home.
Right.
That you sort of they've got to come back home and have a snack, and you get dinner ready and stuff. And you're their mother. Um, they know you do this thing, you do this other thing, but primarily what they're interested in you is, did you like me today? Did I look nice? Were you, they don't care if you're smart, brilliant, creative. What
Right.
they care about is the fact that you're there to look at them, see them,
Yes. And
and go ahead,
care for them. Yeah, no,
to
and
care
to
for
and
them.
and to take care of them in the
Yeah,
beginning. Now
yeah,
it's to get away from me, but
yes. And
that's
how did
important
that,
too.
and I was wondering how that shift was affecting your work. Do you think that the essays were possible, collecting the essays were possible, um, because it was a different bandwidth in your head as an artist?
I certainly, I feel I'm on the cusp of that different bandwidth. So our
Okay.
daughter is a sophomore in college, and our
Mhm.
son's a junior in high school.
Are they in
And
Cambridge or outside of Cambridge?
so our son's in Cambridge with us, and our daughter was home from March until Labor Day, and then she's back on campus at Wesleyan in Connecticut.
Oh, oh yes.
And
I love teaching. That was great.
yeah, she's loving it there. Even, obviously it's not a normal semester, but they do have the students back on campus. And so, I think I remember there's a wonderful Israeli sociologist named Eva Iluz who said to me, this is years ago, she said, having children is like the most awful love story. It's just awful. It ends badly every time. And if it didn't end badly, you would have failed.
Yes,
You
that's
give
right.
all your love, and then they abandon you, and you're supposed to be grateful that they've abandoned you. It's
Yes,
terrible. And
yes,
and it's true. It's a complicated thing, when your kids leave home, because you want them to go and be free and be happy, but you're also like, wait,
where are you
wait.
going? I
Yeah,
remember once sitting with my friend Christine Kim, who's a curator out in LA, and she had just had her daughter, who's now 9, and we were sitting outside, and she started to weep, and I said, "What's wrong?" And she said, just think, all this work so she can leave me."
I know.
And,
I know, right? But
and
it does then change again the balance. So
mm,
there is a little more time, and there will be more time. It's
mm.
different then.
How we tell me how did you, were you always responding to visual art? Were you always interested in painting, or were you interested in women's lives vis-a-vis painting?
Yeah, no, I've always loved paint. It's an interesting dynamic at our house because I'm married to somebody who is very musical, and
Mm,
I'm like a musical moron. I think there's I think like if it has words, I remember the melody, and if it doesn't have words, I have trouble remembering the melody.
Yes.
I live with somebody who is whose sensibility is so orally attuned that he can tell the difference between different recordings of a piece of music, and he
Mhm.
can, he'll know whose recording it is. He also knows, he loves cars, and he knows what car, like he doesn't have to see, he'll say a BMW just went by, he knows from the sound of the engine, right? Like I can't do that.
No.
But on the other hand, he doesn't remember faces, and he doesn't remember, he goes to the museum and looks at pictures and doesn't remember what he's seen.
Wow.
Whereas for me, I remember the pictures, and they move me a great deal. But I don't have any sort of formal training
Mhm.
as a, I maybe in college took 2 art history classes or whatever. I'm an amateur, but
But it,
I love it.
it's that wonderful thing that James Agee started with his first film column for The Nation, when he says, "You're getting someone who's just like you.
Mm.
I'm just enthusiastic about films. I don't know anything. Um, you're getting a very enthusiastic amateur who has language about his feelings." And
Right.
so, one of the things that I love about the book ending and then going towards the end of the book, and then you go to Valeria, whom I've never read. Um, there's a way in which the energy of the book starts to, that wonderful thing about perspective when the lines join.
Mm-hmm.
Tell us a little bit about Valeria, because I've just bought some things because of you. So tell us how that reading came about.
So the piece that's in the book is a review of her novel,
Hmm.
The Lost Children Archive, and which is an amazing novel, um, and amazing in all sorts of different ways. But in its ambition, it's just exhilarating in its ambition and its seriousness. And it's a fiction that came, I think it's fair to say, was born in part out of the experiences that are also in a nonfiction book that she has, a slim nonfiction volume that she wrote, an essay called "Tell Me How It Ends," an essay in 40 questions,
Hmm.
which is about her experience working as a translator, a volunteer translator for an NGO that was helping people with their refugee applications in the courts in New York. And as a result of that experience, or in conjunction with that experience, she and her family took a trip to the Southwest, to the border, to see what was going on about the detaining and deporting of lots of people, but specifically of children. I think that, and it is a, as we all know, it is a desperate and dreadful um, series of events, and will go down in history as a great shame upon this nation.
Yes.
And and it's very dark. And
Yes.
I think one of the things that I find amazing about the novel is that she, through art, she by so this family goes down to the border, and the much of the novel is from the mother's point of view, but the second part is from the older child, the son's point of view, and it is much more like a fairy tale. It's told much, and it isn't necessarily realistic,
Hmm.
but it manages to bring all these different strands together. Um, and there's also a fictional book about the refugee children called I guess, is that actually called the Lost Children, I think, Elena, by somebody named Elena Camposanto, and it's not a real book, but that they're reading as they go. And through art, Luiselli manages to bring some scintilla of hope into this very dark
Wow.
reality. Um,
Well, it's amazing because the your book has that feeling always of coming back from the brink of something dangerous as a reader who has great empathy, or a visual person who has great empathy for the story and for the life of your figures. And one of the last essays in the book joins that, and you're talking about a colleague of yours, Teju Cole, who takes photographs and writes. And tell us what drew you to that, to him as that subject.
So the piece in the book is about his novel Open City, which is
Yes.
now some years old, and in fact he hasn't published a novel since then. He's published his photographs and he's published essays, but I'm hoping there's another novel sometime.
Yeah.
He's now my colleague. I have the great good fortune to have him as a colleague, and he is not, as far as I know, not promising me a novel not this year anyway, but I'm hoping. He's working on other wonderful projects right now, I think. But I think that novel, which if people haven't read it, I recommend it so highly. I mean,
Yeah.
the books that I have included in this collection of essays are all books, when in terms of why it's called an autobiography and essays, they're all books that have changed my life or have changed my understanding of literature or the novel or the capacity of the
How
novel.
to write about the self too.
Exactly, how to write about the self. Yeah, and I feel that they're all books that have marked me and changed me in powerful ways. And so I feel that about Open City, which is a book that manages. Well, there are so many things that it does with such deftness. For one thing, it it creates a completely different sense of a narrative arc, right? It isn't. It's as tight as a drum, and it is plotted, but you don't feel manipulated at any moment by plot. You feel as though you're experiencing life.
Mm-hmm.
Um,
It's a
and
sort of difference between acting and being, right? When you see a
yes,
performer who is acting, it's boring.
right.
But when they're being, it's extraordinary.
Yes, and
Yeah.
it's exactly that, and
Mm.
it enacts all of the um, issues of narrative complexity. Those things that we were talking about earlier, about the uncertainty of what's true and what's real, and what's in your head, and how do you know what really happened, and how do you know what an experience means, or what it was for someone else. And I don't want to sort of give away elements of that novel that you need to experience, but 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 it's narrated by a character who seems very stable and certain, and is a therapist, a psychiatrist. And you come over time to understand the the radical unreliability of what seems a very a very stable narrative.
Well, I want to praise the radical reliability of Claire's amazing book, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write, from Norton. It is Norton, yes?
Yes,
And
it is.
it is one of my favorite top 10 books this year and next year, I know.
Oh,
And it's incredibly beautiful and real about family, becoming a self, reading, self-discovery, family again, and then going on into individual remarks and takes and feelings about a lot of great artists that you should know or have encountered. Everything is fresh. The perspective is only Claire could do it, and it's just one of my favorite books. So please read, buy your copy for Christmas, even in time for Christmas. Claire Messud's Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write. You can get it at Powell's. Support your local bookstores. And Claire, I send you so much love and thanks for being so generous and a lot of fun always to talk to.
And so wonderful, Hilton Als, who send love and thanks to you. Thank you for this wonderful conversation. And thanks to Powell's also for
Yes,
hosting us. Huge thanks
yes.
to Powell.
Well, thank you both
So
so
now,
much.
thank you. And so Emily, you're going to take questions now for
Yeah,
Claire?
I've just got a few questions from the audience here, if
Okay.
that works here.
Sure.
So the first one is from Diane, who asks, which of your novels are the most philosophical, and where did the philosophy come from? Do you draw from philosophers or from experience brought to imagination?
Golly, I don't know. I would I would say I'm no more a philosopher than I am an art critic. So I'm not. I think, that's another thing that's a really great thing about Camus is that he's yes, he's a philosopher, but he's chiefly a writer. He's somebody, as you may know, when he was writing, when he started out, he was making he would write a series. So he would address a topic and he would write an essay and a play and a novel on this theme. So I think I'm going to get it wrong, but Myth of Sisyphus goes with L'étranger. Is that right? And then another, anyway, but they're in series, and I think, one of the reasons he's as it were a philosopher so beloved is because he was writing philosophical novels. I don't think I write philosophical novels in the way that Camus did, but I do think that I'm trying when I write. I'm certainly not. I'm trying when I write to explore these questions of what it's like to be alive, and what it's like to interact with people and have relationships. And I'm not so much. I don't think I write for escapism, as it were. I'm not writing to entertain primarily. I'm writing for something else, because I read for something else. I don't read for escapism particularly. Did I answer the question or not really?
Yeah, I think so. Because I think the question is kind of, what do you draw from? I think that answered it. Here's one from Vicky, who asks, are you optimistic that the grand trajectory of human progress towards the light can be restored with new leadership, or have things been broken too badly? No, it's a tough one right now.
Oh, I know we're in a very particular moment. We were saying, Hilton and I, before we started, I was saying at least that it feels risky to hope right now, but as I have always hung on to, there's a line, I think it's Edgar in King Lear, who says, "'Tis not the worst so long as we can say this is the worst." Right? There is always, or as my grandmother, a lover of adages, my Canadian grandmother used to say, "Where there's life, there's hope."
Yeah.
Right?
Exactly.
Don't you?
My mother used to say, what do you want, blood? So there's.
But don't you think,
I
Hilton, what do
agree.
you
I
think
agree.
about it?
I agree
Yeah.
with you. I agree with you.
Yeah.
Let's see. Bridget asks, curious on the selection of the title, Kant's Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons. I think wanting to know
Okay.
where that came from.
Sure. Yes. So it's actually, the full quote would be Kant's Little East Prussian Head. and I thought East was one word too many to put in the title, so I left that out in the title. But it comes from a book by Thomas Bernhardt, a crabby Austrian writer who was born in 1931 and died in 1989, of whose work I'm particularly fond. A difficult writer,
Yeah.
who writes, but also very funny. He
You
writes
write,
sort of.
you write beautifully about the loser in there. I've struggled with his writing, but I'm going to get there because of you. I've struggled with it. Wittgenstein's nephew and so on. I've struggled with it, but it might just be in the wrong groove,
No, I understand people's. I've taught bits of it and had the students throw it across the room. But it's in part because just simply graphically, it's an act of aggression. He
Yeah.
doesn't paragraph, and he has these very long sentences, and you look at the text and it's unbroken for pages. And
Yeah.
it's an act, that's an act of aggression. You look at it and you think, where am I going to go? At what moment do I get to go pee?
It's
And,
true.
and you don't, like, there's no moment to put the book down.
It's
And
true.
that's, and he's doing that very deliberately. So I sort of love his bullshiness. He's really aggressive. But anyway, but he talks about um, you know, when he's talking about Kant's Little East Russian head, what he's talking about is all of the brilliant thought of Kant, all of the philosophy gets shrunk down like a little shrunken head to this tiny little bit, this tiny little partial bit, like the vegetables in packet soup. You know how the vegetables in packet soup get shrunk down tiny, and he then goes on. He says it's a mere philosophical hue. Like it's only a whiff of what he was trying to say, and I think that one of the things that I find both totally compelling and always tragic about language, right? We have in our heads these huge entire worlds, and we squeeze them down, we funnel them down through language into sentences that are always partial and always failed and always incomplete. You know, there's that thing in Flaubert where he talks in Madame Bovary, where he says, I wanted to make, isn't it in Madame Bovary, where he says, I wanted to make music that would illuminate the stars, but I'm a bare clanging pots, you know. It's just, everything is always so failed.
Yes.
And yet it's like what we were saying about Zoom earlier. At least we have that. Like we can't be together in a room, but imagine if we didn't have Zoom,
Yes.
right? So alas, I can't yet get all the contents of my brain and imagination by putting my finger on the screen. I can't get it into your head, but I can write something, and you can read it,
Yeah.
and some hue of what I have in my head can reach you across countries and centuries and cultures and languages. And man,
Yeah,
I mean, it's pretty awesome, right?
I think so.
Yeah.
Absolutely. The last one I have for you here is for both of you in different parts. And this is from an anonymous attendee who has not yet read the book. But they're interested in the definition of autobiography and essays and how you came to that particular categorization, aside from marketing influences, and more importantly, how you were thinking about the structure of the book. And Hilton, they're also interested to hear your impressions of that structure and if any of the aspects of it struck you as different to what you've seen lately in essay, memoir, and autobiography.
You mean Claire's book?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Mm.
I mean, I think everybody should read Hilton's books, actually, for this really for a really interesting structure of what is an intellectual autobiography as well as a personal one. I mean, I think when I think of White Girls, I think of the essays in there. They're both. I would take it as a model and something I would aspire to. You know, that it's you're writing both intellectually and humanly, you know, at the same time. But how did you structure that book? How did you find a structure for that book?
It was, I wrote the first part very quickly, and I had written other things. The end of the book is the first. I wanted the end of the book to be the first piece of writing that I ever really did that was myself.
Mm-hmm.
And so I was always working backwards. And the story of that girl was the story of growing. She came to every reading I ever did. I wanted to honor her, but also to talk about the ways in which the years had passed with her as a sort of audience or and champion, really. And so when I read, but this, to get to Claire, when I read Claire's book, I was so moved by the emotional structure of it, that Claire begins with a very long introduction about family and reading and writing. And then it goes into pieces that are autobiographical, but also have some tie to culture and then it goes to cultural artifacts, and then we end with a kind of wonderful amalgamation of visual and verbal objects and what they mean to her and how they've shaped her Claire's eye. So I responded very emotionally to the structure of the book. And I think sometimes those structures can be conscious, but also unconscious at the same time, that they just made sense to you. No, Claire, to put it in that order?
Yeah, I think it was intuitive in some way, but I also think it came out of, to go back to almost the beginning of our conversation, it sort of came out of this idea that, or this experience that when we were talking about faith and home and those questions, and the books are as much a part of my experience and as much a part of my who I am as anything else in my life. And I think, that's one thing I feel so powerfully. And it, okay, I just have to I get a little cranky when people say that, literature is elitist, because it is the most profoundly anti-elitist experience to read. It can take you can walk into a public library, well, when there isn't COVID, right? Aren't libraries the most incredible thing,
Are you
right?
kidding? I was the kid who used to cut school, Claire, to go to the library,
Right,
because you were free. And
free and could
I
go.
think that it's wonderful. What's that wonderful Elizabeth Hardwick line where she says, the invention of the paperback changed everything. It was cheap, it was nourishing, and it was like having a delicious bowl of soup or coffee. It was nourishing in that way.
Yeah.
And I think that it is insane to call it elitist when in fact the whole point is for us to share.
Yes,
Yeah.
and that it gives you freedom,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
That each little book, look behind Hilton and see all those books, and
Yeah.
each and every one is an entire world.
That's right.
Right? Like there is so much experience and adventure and knowledge and erudition and thoughtfulness and generosity in the room behind you. It's
The world,
just,
we live in a well-traveled world when we can read.
yes.
Well, anyway, Emily, there you go. I hope that was good. Those were good answers.
A great answer. And I love your bookshelves. I've just been
Let me
looking at
show you
those.
something.
Yeah.
It goes all the way down there,
Wow.
Oh,
and then it goes over.
the dream.
Fab.
Well, thank you both. Claire, the book, again, one more time, guys, is called Little Prussian Head and Other Reasons Why I Write by Claire Messud. Run out and get a copy, order from Powell's bookstore at once, just in time for Christmas and Thanksgiving. Thank you again, Claire. It's been a great pleasure.
Thank you.
And
Thank you.
thank
so
you,
much.
Emily.
Thank you,
Thank you
Emily.
both so much. And do consider buying the book and buy Hilton's books as well.
Thank you. Bye.
Take care and have a great night.
Bye.